And now I would like to welcome Betsy Fisher, U.S. Director at Talent Beyond Boundaries, and also a lecturer in international refugee law at the University of Michigan Law School. Betsy, thank you so much for hopping on today's episode of Immigration and Mobility Decoded.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very excited to talk to you today. We have a lot of great topics that we just want to talk with you about. But first, just want to see how it's going. We are recording this towards the end of March, and you are at University of Michigan. I believe you did your undergrad there as well. Is that correct?
I did not. I am a proud alum of Denison University in Granville, Ohio, but also a big fan of Michigan. And we're recording this the day before the first round of March Madness, where the Michigan women will no doubt beat the Kansas women's basketball team. Go Blue.
There we go. Who do you have winning the women's bracket?
So I think you got to go South Carolina. Odds are they're going to pull it out, but I'd love to see an upset too.
Yeah, I was in my head. I was gonna say. I imagine a lot of people have South Carolina. I have Iowa. I'm just when we originally talked, you were going to a game to see Caitlin Clark.
I saw Caitlin Clark.
Back, right?
Yeah, I think she's incredible. I think South Carolina, you can't beat the depth and the well-roundedness of the whole roster. But I think it's going to be really exciting.
Agreed. Who do you have winning on the men's side?
I went dark horse. There's no Michigan team to root for there. I picked Marquette. You heard it here first. I don't know. We'll see. It'll be fun.
Marquette. I mean, they are a 2 seed out on the East bracket, but yeah, they're a solid team. I got the Illini.
There you go.
We're Big Ten rivals. But you have the football championship to start the year, so you got us beat.
Yeah, it's been a fun year for sports already in March.
Definitely. Yeah. So, Betsy, very excited to talk to you today, and particularly, the work that you do, the topics that you've written a lot of great research papers. So we're going to dive into some of those in a bit. But I just wanted to start this conversation off by asking you, what does it mean to be a refugee?
Yeah, a refugee, this is a term that was actually defined in an international treaty that was passed in 1951. To simplify it, it's a person who is outside of their home country because they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of who they are or what they believe. So it's someone who is displaced because they're concerned about human rights violations in their country of origin.
And what is the difference between refugees and migrants?
So the thing that these groups have in common is that they're, away from home. I think usually we talk about migrants being outside of their country of origin. The thing that makes refugees different or differentiated is that fear of returning because of their protected status. So a migrant might be away from home for temporary work opportunity and then intend to return, whereas a refugee is displaced because of this fear of being harmed.
I see. And historically, how has the U.S. helped refugees?
There's a long history of the U.S. engaging to support people who are displaced. Thinking about when, just for example, Vietnam was facing significant conflict and U.S. military engagement, and people across the country sponsored refugees from Vietnam and from the region and welcomed them into their communities. But then there's also, I think, long periods and specific, really shameful events where the U.S. didn't take steps to protect people. Thinking about in the 1930s when U.S. immigration policy was focused on restricting entry from Jewish refugees fleeing from Europe. And we, hopefully your listeners are familiar with the story of the St. Louis, the ship that was turned back. If you're not, please go, please learn about that. But there's a history of the U.S. providing refugee resettlement and asylum to people who are displaced, and also opportunities for the U.S. to do much more, I think.
What are some additional examples, whether current or prior, of programs, the U.S. programs designed to help refugees come into the U.S., set up a life, work, and ultimately have that fulfilling life?
Yeah, there's two main opportunities for people who are displaced to come to the U.S. and to have long-term status. One is for people who are outside the U.S. and who are identified to need a long-term residency and opportunity to belong. And that's called the U.S. Refugee Resettlement System. Its formal name is the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. The other is for people who arrive in the United States and who have a fear of going home, and that we call the asylum process. There's other programs as well, notably for Afghanistan, for people who had connections with the U.S. government in Afghanistan. There's what's called the Special Immigrant Visa Program, and then there's many forms of temporary protection where people are able to come to the U.S. but don't have the same like bridge to citizenship as people in resettlement or asylum programs.
And that would be the TPS program.
TPS or parole. So TPS is temporary protected status, which protects people who shouldn't be asked to return because of some humanitarian crisis or natural disaster in their home country. Parole is a very flexible method that the U.S. government can allow people to enter the country. And neither of these programs provide a bridge to long-term status or citizenship in the U.S.
And why is that?
Well, I think temporary protected status, the idea is that it's a temporary measure. The hope is that conditions will stabilize. So it's a way to kind of ride out something that's maybe a temporary situation. But you point to a big question. Once we know that things are long term or that it's unlikely that people can go back, should we look at ways for people to remain long term? Congress used to, in the good old days, pass adjustment acts that would let people who arrived in the U.S. on parole or other similar statuses to be able to access that green card status, and we haven't seen the same engagement from Congress recently.
Gotcha. Yeah, it feels like a lot of immigration these days ultimately falls to whatever power the executive branch has,
Yeah.
and that can go either way and also be turned back, and it's kind of a mess when it
Yeah.
comes to making changes to the U.S. immigration system.
Yeah.
So I guess, Betsy, that leads to, how does the current U.S. immigration system help refugees?
Sure. So there are these programs, asylum and resettlement, that they're very limited. For asylum, obviously that's only for people who are here, but the U.S. government also has an extremely narrow interpretation of the refugee definition. It imposes all sorts of barriers that are not present in the definition of refugee status that I described earlier. We deny people status if they had an offer of residency somewhere else, even if they couldn't access that anymore. We deny people access to status if they didn't file for asylum within 1 year of entering, even if they didn't know that they couldn't access asylum. And even when the results of that 1 year filing deadline is that they would be returned to forcible harm, because the backup form of protection has an even higher evidentiary standard, referring to withholding of removal and Convention Against Torture protection. So the U.S. Falls pretty far short of its obligations of not returning people to places where they would be harmed, and also certainly can be doing more to provide opportunities for people to come to the U.S. Affirmatively through resettlement or other programs.
Why does the government take such a limited definition approach?
I think there's a concern that many people in the world want to come to the U.S., and the more flexible the standard, the more the program is vulnerable to abuse. That's also why we've seen things like the U.S. government restricting access to work permits for people with employment authorization. And my counterpoint to that would be that the alternative risk is that people end up facing persecution, facing torture, facing serious harm, because we're afraid that we're protecting too many people. And I think we've also seen in the U.S. that immigration programs, as I think we'll discuss later, are actually really important, and that these programs that are meant to be humanitarian become a lifeline for the U.S. economy also in times of labor demand.
Do you ever see a situation where the U.S. expands the definitions and takes a different approach?
Sure. So one example is that in the 1990s, in the midst of The Chinese policy of limiting families to having one child. U.S. Congress passed legislation that recognized people who are facing forcible sterilization as having a well-founded fear of being persecuted on the basis of political opinion. So that's just sort of statutorily recognizing a group of people as refugees without requiring them to establish those elements independently for each, person by person. And we've also seen situations where the U.S. government acts to provide temporary forms of protection like parole to large groups of people without requiring them to meet the refugee definition. But again, I would note that that's a really temporary form of protection and doesn't provide the same rights and benefits.
So then, Betsy, is it fair to say that there are gaps in the system?
Absolutely. I think, sitting in the U.S., we can describe particular policies that we'd love to see. But if you're a refugee who's in a place, you've left your home country and you're sitting in a country where you don't have full legal rights, you'll never have the opportunity to become a citizen. You're probably unable either to work or to work in your preferred career. I think you'd be hard pressed. You wouldn't be thinking about the gaps. You'd be wondering where the solid matter is. And I say that because only about 1% of refugees are ever considered for resettlement globally. And most refugees do live in those countries where they lack long-term residency, often very close to the situations they were displaced from. So most refugees from Syria, for example, are in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. They're not in the United States. And so if you're somebody in that region, you would be asking where the avenues for protection are, not where the gaps are.
Interesting question on my end. After that, how do other countries, help refugees, and what are they doing differently that the U.S. isn't doing, or maybe what are they doing? What aren't they doing that maybe the U.S. is doing?
Sure. So the U.S. for a long time has been a historical leader in the number of people resettled. That stopped being true for a period of time, while Canada actually had the largest numbers in absolute terms. But countries like Canada have often resettled more people per capita. So, per the size, adjusted for the size of population, they've had more. Other countries have a more generous interpretation of the refugee standard and have fewer limitations. And then we think about countries with a lot fewer resources that are, in practice, hosting millions of people, huge percentages of their population. Thinking about a place like Colombia, where there's something like 3 million Venezuelans who are living there. And most of them have received access to work permits and various regularization programs. There's much more that we could discuss, and many challenges with those policies. But we're seeing countries that are much closer to situations of displacement also offer, pretty generous forms of welcome in some instances. And the question is how countries like the U.S. can support those countries and can ensure that displaced people eventually have access to long-term status.
Betsy, in late 2023, you released a paper that we will link below and share with our audience, examining Priority 2 or P2 group designers that offer the promise of efficient resettlement processing for groups of refugees that share common characteristics. But you noted many P2 groups have failed to advance efficient resettlement. Can you dive more on why is this and share a little bit more insights regarding your recent paper?
So just a little bit of background on this. When the U.S. Resettles people, there's millions of displaced people in the world. So how do you figure out which people in a world of 36 million refugees and 110 million displaced people? How do you identify the 125,000 who will be resettled to the U.S.? And the U.S. has four main avenues that it identifies people by. One is individual basis, from referrals from the UN Refugee Agency or others. And then there's family designations, so people who have family members already in the U.S. We now have a brand new program for sponsorship called Welcome Corps or P4. And then P2, Priority 2, is group-based designations. So designating a group of people and saying that if you belong to this group, we will consider you for resettlement. presumably because there's some common thread, common characteristic, common need across all of those people. And so this becomes a really common point for advocacy when there's a new humanitarian crisis. With the fall of Afghanistan, for example, with the fall of the Ghani government in Afghanistan, there was a question: how can we support people who aren't in the SIV program to relocate to the U.S.? And one solution, which was implemented, is a P2 program. But that program and many others have faced really significant challenges in actually helping people to move to the US through resettlement. And that's because in a humanitarian crisis, there are also massive logistical issues. Can people leave the country? Where can there be actual processing done? What's the physical place that someone can go to have their fingerprints taken, to do an interview? And in a place of active conflict, that's really, really challenging. And so, you have to coordinate with host governments who may or may not want refugees accessing services in their territory, who might be worried that a program like this would attract more people. And so this becomes a program that, in many cases, has existed on paper, but has very small numbers of people who are actually able to access protection. And my concern is that in some cases, people are making plans for their future, for their safety, for their families, based on the promise of a program that isn't actually able to deliver.
What traits are required for successful P2 designations?
Yeah, I think I outlined 5 of them in the paper, but I think just to focus on a couple that are really important. One is really clear eligibility guidelines. If you have 1 million people who could be eligible for a program, you don't have the capacity within the US government to suss out who fits, who is eligible, and you might face a deluge of applications that you then have to sort through to process. So having clear guidelines on who's eligible, how they prove that they're eligible, and often with a defined group of a manageable size, that's really important. And then the second is a plan of how and where you're going to do the processing. If people are fleeing from a conflict, that place of conflict is not going to be where you're going to have home base to have US government personnel and support staff. So figuring out which host government, ideally somewhere close by, can do that is absolutely essential to making any program work.
And are these programs, are they overseen, was it USCIS, State Department? Which branch is ultimately playing the biggest role in designing them and maintaining them?
Designations come from the State Department. Sometimes Congress requires designation, but that comes from the State Department. But the resettlement program is a cooperative effort. The State Department has an initial role in identifying who's eligible and facilitating the processing. USCIS conducts the ultimate adjudications of who will be approved. And then many law enforcement agencies have a role in security checks. And then the Department of the Department of Health and Human Services plays a role in supporting people on their arrival in the U.S., along with the State Department again.
So truly a government, many different departments playing a helping hand.
It is a complex process, yes.
Yes. So yes, we will link that research paper and others below. But Betsy, I want to shift a little bit to talking about refugee labor mobility and expanding the workforce through displaced talent. So in the U.S. currently, can refugees work?
Yeah, refugees who come through the resettlement program or who are approved for asylum, people in both of those categories can work, as immigration lawyers would say, incident to lawful status. So that means that by virtue of being in those statuses, they can work. They don't have to separately apply for employment authorization. People who are seeking asylum have to wait 6 months until they can work. And what my organization is trying to do at Talent Beyond Boundaries, or TBB, we're trying to support refugees who are outside the United States to access a route to safety here through employment-based visas and employment-based immigration pathways, so that we can move beyond that 1% of people who are considered for resettlement and expand opportunities for them to reach safety.
And so do you operate just in the U.S. or are you a global company?
So we support refugees to relocate to the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and then several countries throughout the European Union. And we're supporting refugees who are in a variety of locations from the Middle East to East Africa, India, Latin America, and a hodgepodge of places in between.
Lovely, lovely. You mentioned UK and Canada. How do these other well, in other countries can refugees work, or is there a similar? They have to wait a certain amount of time before doing so.
So I'm not sure that I can speak too authoritatively about each of those processes, but people who are recognized as asylum seekers or who are resettled to those places are certainly able to work. I believe that there are restrictions, particularly in the UK, on access to work while you're waiting. Certainly, we've had a lot of headlines about people living on really modest stipends while they're waiting for work authorization. In the US, we don't provide such stipends. Uh, but we're working in each of those countries on a similar model also to be connecting refugees outside of those places with work opportunities as another avenue.
What role do refugees play in the workforce and the broader economy? Asking me, because have they helped the U.S. economy? If we're looking back 2022, 2023, particularly last year, everyone was talking about recession. But actually, earlier as quarter one has gone by, there's been a few research papers coming out. I think there was recently one from Brookings. I might be a little bit wrong on the name, showing the impact that immigrants have had on the economy and the contributions they make. So I'm wondering, what role do refugees play in helping the broader U.S. economy?
Yeah, you're right. I think we're seeing really strong empirical evidence that immigration was a huge contributor to what we're calling the soft landing from the expected recession. Just among others, the Federal Reserve released a paper indicating that immigration was a huge boon to the economy. The Congressional Budget Office has also had very similar findings. I think what can be a little challenging is to parse, particularly so close to the time, like as things are happening, is to parse how much of those contributions came from which segments. So how much of this came from people who are, asylum seekers currently versus people who landed in the U.S. in 2021 and 2022 from Afghanistan. I think those are challenges, but we've seen really robust studies in the past that people who come to the U.S. through resettlement initially receive services from state, local, federal government, and over time become net contributors in just in their taxes, which doesn't even consider their contributions to the local economy as consumers and as employees.
What role, if any, do state and local governments help or play in helping asylum seekers seek employment?
State and local governments can play an absolutely critical role, and I think in the current environment, we're seeing states and localities of all political viewpoints step up to assist asylum seekers in getting work authorization and connecting them to work because they're facing so much pressure from the employers and businesses in their localities looking for help. So there's, a few examples are states that are working to address licensing barriers to say, you know what, we desperately need people in skilled trades. How can we make sure that people who have skills can get the credentials to get into those jobs? Because that's the only way we're going to get out of our housing crisis is to have people who are qualified to help us, construct new housing. Another is, investments in workforce development and in language training, in job matching services. And again, we're seeing those in areas across the country. So states and localities can certainly make people feel welcome, have a role in kind of setting the tone, but can be, in some cases, very operationally involved as well.
So, Betsy, you mentioned that states and localities across the country are really doing a lot to help asylum seekers find employment. But I'm curious, are there particular regions or parts of the country that are maybe doing more? The reason I'm asking is, we are recording this on March 22nd, the end of the H-1B electronic registration, very competitive visa. And over the last few years, there's been additionally a lot of research papers showing that parts of the country want and need that late additional employment help. So I'm wondering, parts of the Midwest, for example, are some of them doing more to try to attract and help asylum seekers?
Sure, I think there's a range of engagement in the Midwest. I think is a great example because these are places that have relatively affordable cost of living as compared with places that might be more obvious to newcomers to the U.S., like New York or Chicago. So, just one example: the state of North Dakota, um, which is, I think, not the first place that a lot of people would think of, and as a place to move to in the U.S. as a newcomer, and also maybe not the first place that Americans would think of as being a destination for refugees and immigrants. But they legislated last year an office that's supporting businesses to identify and support people to move there, and then in turn creating a welcoming environment for people. So, I mean, that's just one example, but I think the labor demands are creating realities of needing to consider immigration as one part of a workforce strategy, and that's what it should be. There should be opportunities for people who have been closed out of the workforce for so long: working parents, people with disabilities, people who've had experience in the criminal justice system. The benefits of an economy are opportunities for everybody, and immigration should be one part of that strategy, alongside with other initiatives that really open opportunities for people who have had skills and had contributions all along.
I agree. I agree. Back in January, Betsy, you wrote a letter to the editor that was published in the New York Times, in which you write that the Biden administration can adopt changes to facilitate displaced people's access to employment opportunities without legislation. What are some of these changes you think the administration can make?
Sure. So, just two examples. One is something that we've been working on extensively: is improving policies around visa processing for people who don't have a current travel document. Many refugees aren't able to renew a passport because they can't contact their embassy because it would place them at risk. Stateless people often have never had a current travel document. So, just as one example, we partnered with another organization called United Stateless to submit a comment on the H-1B registration change. And we're able to secure a change to the final rule that said that people who have not just a passport, but a travel document, which could be because they're refugees or stateless people, they'll have access to the H-1B registration process. We'd love that to be more flexible. We'd love there to be a recognition that there are incredible people who are qualified and who have other forms of documentation that aren't travel documents, but we were nonetheless really proud to be able to secure that change. A second is something that people far beyond our spheres have been advocating for, and that's a Schedule A update. Schedule A is a list of occupations that don't have to get a labor certification demonstrating a shortage of qualified workers. And Schedule A has been the same since I was in diapers. There is no reason for a tool for flexibility for filling roles should go unused and be so anachronistic. So updating Schedule A is something that the Department of Labor appears to be looking at, and something that sort of, regardless of how you feel about immigration, it's just intellectually dishonest to say that the only occupations with nationwide labor shortages right now are physical therapists and nurses. It defies logic and reasoning, and so we'd obviously be supportive of efforts to make that policy consistent with reality.
I think there's still the comment period is still open,
It is.
or yeah.
That is my understanding. It was extended. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I feel like I had heard about it. I just didn't want to. I didn't want to say it and be wrong, but
I'm with
now
you.
the light bulb went off. um, so Betsy, I want to zoom out a little bit and just look
Yeah.
at some other countries around the world and just hear your opinions and just your expertise on what are other countries doing to help asylum seekers seek employment, and how do they compare as well as contrast with the U.S.
One thing I would point to, and that Talent Beyond Boundaries has worked extensively on, is Canada's Economic Mobility Pathways Pilot, or EMPP. This is a program that TBB advocated for a long time with the Canadian government, and it's essentially a hybrid humanitarian economic visa. And so, if a refugee who's outside Canada gets a job offer from a Canadian employer, um, they can receive an economic visa, but with accommodations, with flexibility. So if they don't have a travel document, if they don't have extensive documentation of all of their employment or education, those aren't strict barriers. There's flexibility in the process. And if they're approved, they receive permanent residency when they arrive. And with that comes, access to services that we know the Canadian government offers to its residents, including healthcare. So it's a recognition that people have a lot to contribute, and also that the reality of displacement makes certain things about employment based visas challenging. And I think it's a real model for other governments to follow.
Betsy, we are still early in the year, but it is 2024, obviously an election year here in the U.S. What role does the party holding the White House? What influence does that political party or the person who's president have in making future decisions and kind of potentially laying out the vision for refugee programs and et cetera?
Sure. So I think almost complete authority, right? So on the one hand, the refugee resettlement program we saw under the previous administration was extremely easy to upset and to gut. The refugee resettlement program and the asylum programs were pretty comprehensively devastated. We've seen a very significant rebound under this administration in the resettlement program, but we've seen an ongoing policy of adding restrictions and limiting access to asylum from this administration. I think the other answer is as much power as Congress lets them have. In the current moment, Congress has completely abdicated authority in immigration, and the only option that a president has, no matter their viewpoint, is to take action on their own because Congress is not showing up as a partner. You mentioned it's March 22nd as we're recording. We are 12 hours from a government shutdown and almost 6 months into a fiscal year, and there is no year-long spending bill passed. It is a terrible way to run a country, and so part of why the president has so much authority is that Congress has not been a partner in governance, and that enables these wild fluctuations in policy that we've seen.
Betsy, are there any pieces of immigration legislation that you're currently eyeing or you're hearing chatter about that maybe you're interested in?
I think what we would love to see is legislation that would provide more opportunities for employment based visas, or at least flexibility when economic conditions provide for larger amounts of work based immigration. What we're finding is that no one's opposed to hiring refugees if they're qualified. People want good help. Nobody is opposed to paying for good help if that's what it takes. The challenge that we have in matching refugees with U.S. employers is the time. To hire someone who's outside the U.S. through an employment-based visa is going to be usually a couple of years. For an EB-2 NIW, a national interest waiver, where you don't need to go through a perm process. Those visas are backlogged. To get an H-1B, you have low odds through the lottery, and you have to wait for the lottery cycle. There's no option that provides help at the level of urgency that employers face and that corresponds with their business need. So more visas to respond to that level of need, or at least to provide flexibility when the economic conditions require it. That would be, I think, one thing that we would be really eager for. And I think the place where we'd be most likely to see some movement is in healthcare, where not only are the conditions most urgent, but they're most urgently impacting rural areas that are likely to have um, representation from a party that is less supportive of immigration at the moment.
So, Betsy, I want to wrap up and just kind of let you talk a little bit more about your organization, Talent Beyond Boundaries, or TBB. I know you mentioned a little bit earlier, but I would just love to hear more and love for you to share with the audience an overview, more of the work that you do in connecting employers with refugees, and overall how you operate.
Yeah, thanks. So we have two main avenues of work. One is working to make employment-based opportunities, to make work-based immigration accessible to displaced people. So that means working with governments to open immigration pathways like the EMPP that I mentioned. We also work with like trade organizations to identify licensing issues. Our UK team was able to develop a policy for nurses to be relicensed that had flexibility on some of the things that I mentioned earlier, while insisting on a really high standard of qualifications to make sure that people are getting the care that they need. So really working to change the system of employment-based immigration to work for the realities of displaced people, meaning both skills and the need for flexibility. And then we also do matching between employers and refugees. We have a platform called the Talent Catalog, where tens of thousands of displaced people have registered their skills and experience. And then employers in the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, and in several countries in the EU can contact us and identify, hey, I'm really looking to hire a machinist or an electrician or a climate change consultant, whatever it is that they're looking to find. And we identify candidates from the talent catalog to then support them through the process.
And so, do employers come to you first, or what does that process look like?
Yeah, we are open to being contacted at any point in time, talentbeyondboundaries.org. We also go to conferences or are introduced to people. Oftentimes, immigration lawyers are recommending us to their clients as one part of a strategy to address their labor needs. And so once we get in touch with someone, however that starts, if they express an interest, we'll figure out what their initial needs are and what the available immigration pathways might be. We ask them for an MOU that just sets out kind of the mutual expectations, what we'll do, what we need from them to make it work. We have the employer identify the specific job descriptions that they're looking to hire for. And then we identify candidates who we also support to make sure that they feel comfortable for the expectations of what an interview in that context might be. And if there's a fit, we then support both sides in the mobility process, including by working with Immigration Counsel.
Betsy, as we look to wrap things up, I always kind of like to ask these types of questions. If you could wave your magic wand, what legislative changes would you make to the existing U.S. immigration system?
And you didn't make me just choose one, so we could be here a while. I already mentioned increased flexibility in employment-based visas. More visas when times are good. Also, Migration Policy Institute put out a paper on a bridge visa. The idea that if you come here for something like an H-1B, you should be able to get a green card. This idea of people being in limbo and waiting indefinitely after building our life here and investing here, we shouldn't have that problem. So a bridge to a green card. I teach international refugee law. If I could wave a magic wand, I would make the U.S. refugee definition compliant with international law by scaling back statutory bars like firm resettlement and material support. And I also do pro bono work. So if I could wave that wand one more time, I would pass the Stateless Protection Act, which gives stateless people access to a pathway to citizenship in the U.S. And other things like a travel document.
Anything else that you wish to highlight that we didn't hit on earlier?
I guess just one thing is, we're in early days in the U.S. in building our program, so we're always eager to connect with employers. But I also want to highlight we are really excited about some of the advocacy success that we've seen in the U.S. The spending bills that we hope will be passed today include reporting requirements. The accompanying reports have directives to the Department of State to be exploring ways to expand refugee labor mobility in the US, and also to explain to the appropriations committees in Congress how they accommodate visa processing for refugees and stateless people. So those are things we've been advocating for a long time. A reporting requirement won't change the world, but it does urge the department to think about it and hopefully to start moving. So we're excited to be seeing early days in congressional engagement around these ideas.
Any words of wisdom with regards to advocacy? How can employers or listeners advocate, and what paths do you recommend?
Yeah, I think the role of employers as advocates just can't be, the potential for that role can't be overstated. Employers who think, I'd love to be involved, but I can't wait 2 years. That's a great opportunity for you to be engaging with your congressional leadership and saying, we need action here. We need additional employment based visas. We need legislation that would promote better economic inclusion for refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. So that could include things like federal legislation that could identify some ways to make state and local licensing better. And I think, as always, on advocacy, it's about being dedicated, focused on the mission, and persistent, because things can take years and not go anywhere and then come down off the shelf and pass overnight. But it's about we can't control the outcome as advocates, but we can always make sure that our stories are out there.
Well said. Well said. Where can listeners find you and your work? I know I mentioned some research papers earlier, but where can listeners find all those materials?
Sure. So you can learn more about TBB at talentbeyondboundaries.org. I'm on the entity formerly known as Twitter at Betsy L. Fisher, BetsyLFisher, though I'm not nearly as active in the post Twitter days. And I believe you'll be posting the research papers there. So people are welcome to get in touch and have a look.
Final question. Anything in particular you want to highlight or plug?
I think, the Michigan-Kansas game at 2 p.m. Eastern on March 23rd. No, I think if folks are interested, take a look at there's a very brief letter to the editor that we discussed earlier from January that just lays out very briefly some of the advocacy that we've been doing and links to some of our other work. So take a look at the January New York Times letter to the editor. And as I said, get in touch if you have thoughts.
Well, Betsy, it's been a pleasure chatting with you this morning. Really appreciate the time, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and go Blue.